welcome to My Voices Have Tourettes, and that's why I'm trying to catch a falling star. That makes no sense, but we're going to roll with it. My name is Dan Zarin. Let's get started here. So today's episode is brought to you by Gamesla Studio, where we are recording, The Secret Cellar, Iceland's first and only comedy club, and Smári's Volcano Sauces, the greatest hot sauces I've ever had in my entire life. And by the way, if you are in Iceland right now, go to Pizzan. They now have a pizza called the Volcano Pizza, which Smári created himself, and it includes his sauce Hekla. It's very, very good. I've tried it. But moving on, because that is not what this episode is about. This episode is about our guest, who is absolutely incredible. She describes herself as a recovering celebrity. She is a comedian, writer, professionally trained classical dancer, choreographer. Yeah, you know what? For the sake of trying to cut a very easily 2-hour introduction into 30 seconds, she does a lot. You may know her from her for her roles on TV in the late 80s and 90s. Her one-woman show All of Me, which got her nominated for the Best Newcomer Award in Edinburgh. Her short films Jesus is Lord, Pussy Got Your Tongue, and Tiziana Bubarini. That was the greatest transition of titles ever. And this year, she is performing a brand new live show called Catch a Falling Star, which we're going to talk all about. Let's just welcome Tania Lacy.
Thank you. That's quite some introduction.
I do my best. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, today.
So you're living in Berlin.
That's right. I'm married to a German, but he's not like other Germans. He's happy. Yeah, we live in Berlin. We basically moved here because we wanted our son to speak German, and that wasn't going to happen in Australia. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, to be fair, Australian accents can be tough to understand anyway. So learning a foreign language, I mean, that was the way to go.
True. And I learned the very first time I moved overseas was to America, and I learned very quickly that I needed to adjust my accent so that people could understand me. Yeah. And yeah, so I became much better spoken from traveling. Yeah,
I have a friend of mine who's also a comedian here. Well, he just moved out of Iceland. His name's John O'Duffy. He's Australian as well. And he always talked about how he had to gradually change his accent in Iceland because no one understood what he was saying.
Yep. I understand.
I have to make a comment because I kind of just realized something that you have a book that you wrote. It's called Tracy Lacy is Completely Cuckoo Bananas. And that would have made way more sense for the intro to this episode, saying, welcome to My Voices Have Tourettes, and that's why I'm completely cuckoo bananas.
Yeah. No, that was actually a kid's book, and that was such a joy to write because, you know, like I had an opportunity to really talk about just being who you are and to make it funny, you know, like a lot of books for girls, they miss on the sense of humor. They're sort of so entrenched in this, you know, what role girls must play that often there's no jokes made about, you know, what life's like as a young woman.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I find that, well, like when it comes to these topics that we should be talking about, and especially with children, that they should be hearing about, there is a lack of comedy with it. And I like the reason I started joking about my tics. Well, first of all, it's really hard to hide sounding like the Pillsbury Doughboy, but I mean, I joke about it because like humor is how people learn. I mean, it's hard to remember when you're just listening to a lecture.
Well, that's right. And you know, we have a 15-year-old son, and often the only way we get to talk about the issues that are important is through talking through humor. Yeah. So, and it's the only way to get through to him. So yeah, we do utilize that a lot. Yeah.
And I mean, speaking of, you know, being open. So, I mean, one of the big topics I wanted to discuss here is you started opening up about having borderline personality disorder in 2014. To the listeners, be sure to check out a video that Tania did for the feed on YouTube. It's an absolutely incredible video. First of all, could you maybe explain what borderline personality disorder is for the listeners that maybe don't know what it is?
Yeah. Well, it is it's very hard to explain. There's 9 main features of borderline personality, and I guess the strongest one for me has been fear of abandonment.
Okay.
It's it's a comorbid kind of situation. So you might have depression, drug addiction, eating disorders, body dysmorphia, all these things sort of pile into one illness that they sort of say puts you on the borderline of so many different illnesses.
Right.
So it is a difficult illness to treat, and it's difficult to live with. Certainly over time, I feel like I've gotten better, but yeah, it's not a fun disorder.
No.
What is?
Well, I mean, things can be fun, but it's the stuff that isn't that kind of takes precedent.
Yeah. And, it's difficult to control your emotions with this disorder. It's you often feel empty. There can be self-harm. And I think one of the things for me was controlling my moods, controlling my anger. Mm-hmm. That was always really difficult. So, yeah, there's a lot to it, and it's difficult to treat and difficult to sort of I didn't even know if I was getting any better, but I look back now to 5 years ago, and even in that time, I think I've gotten better. Yeah.
I was going to say how have things been since that video? I mean, you described that experience kind of like a coming out. Well, how's it been since then?
Well, certainly I feel that having this illness has prevented me from going forward in my career in a way that I would really like. Mm-hmm. It's affected a lot of professional relationships, and it has been an illness that sometimes makes it difficult for me to work. Mm-hmm. So in that regard, those kind of issues continue. But certainly for me as a person, I've worked really, really hard on trying to improve myself and managing to incorporate different ways of coping into my life, skills that I didn't have before. And that has certainly made a difference.
Yeah. Yeah, because you mentioned something in the video. I mean, and this is stuck with me so much. What was when you talked about employment, and you talked about how you would never tell an employer that you had a mental illness because people are afraid of them. And I mean, that resonates so much with me as a Tourettic person, because Tourette's is kind of the reason why for a long time I just gave up on applying for jobs. I just didn't think it was a possibility.
Yeah, well, and I often, cancer is a terrible disease. There's no denying that. But if you have cancer, there isn't sort of the fear that if you mention you have a mental illness. If you have cancer, and I have had friends who've had cancer, and I have helped them, and I have been part of the food train and the picking up and dropping off of kids. All those things are organized. I'm pretty sure I could die in my apartment and my cat eat me for a week with mental illness, and people wouldn't even, think to call, because they're frightened by it. They don't know what it means to have a mental illness. And so they stay away. And often the people who are affected by the mental illness also keep back, because we don't want to be a burden. We don't want to be a downer on people. So it's difficult. I would really love it to get to a point where you could mention that you have a mental illness and people will rally rather than run.
I mean, that's what we want, and it's a good point that you brought up with cancer, because I have literally been told to my face when I open up about Tourette syndrome, people are like, well, it's not like you have cancer, calm down. And I'm like, yeah, but I mean, that's not to say that this stuff isn't important to talk about.
I when I was writing my second book, I was going through a particularly bad time, and it was really rough. And I was running late with the book, and I remember hearing from someone else, another author had been diagnosed with cancer, and the publishers basically wrote her book for her.
Really?
Because, they wanted to help and they needed to get that book out. But, like you don't get that kind of help when you've got a mental illness.
Yeah.
And I can only put it down to fear and a lack of understanding of what the illness is.
Yeah. I mean, well, that's the thing is, I've talked with several people on this podcast about disability and how with disability, benefits and such. I mean, people have to go through like absolute trauma just to even get help. I mean, there are people that won't even, like, they'll be basically suffering to no end, and the government will not help them because they're not bad enough. Bad enough to care. And it's really, it's not just heartbreaking, it's just inappropriate.
Well, the interesting point is, what is bad enough? Is it when the person has taken their own life? Or tried to take their own life? And a lot of times that's the only time that people do get taken seriously with mental illness. And I find it so sad. I would like to be in a position with employment whereby I can say, look, it's a rough week for me, and I've got to spend a bit more time at the doctor's or whatever, and I would get given that time. I'm sure if I was going for chemo treatment, it wouldn't be a problem.
Right.
And I'm not at all minimizing cancer at all. I'm just saying that the difference is astounding. And I remember back when I was a young child, so this was the early 70s, people talked about cancer in whispers, like they talk about mental illness now. People would not. Yeah, they did. And it was like, oh, she's got cancer. And it was, it was very much, people then were afraid of it. They didn't understand it. They didn't know what it meant. And so I see a similar kind of situation existing with mental illness now. Like, we're talking about it, but it's still in hushed tones.
Yeah.
And, I think it's got to be loud, and it's got to be like, let's talk about it. Let's get familiar enough with it so that people are not afraid of us and what our illness means. Because the other thing that I've always said is that my illness has enabled me to create some incredible work. My illness means that I see the world in a way that I can put that on the page and people love it.
Yeah.
What they don't like is all the shit that comes with it. And that's the hard part, that I can't seem to find a balance of being able to get that stuff on the page and keeping the other stuff away from a position of work.
I have to say this 100% reminds me of literally one of my favorite things that I've ever wrote or read that you said, and it was about the situation when you were fired from ABC for the big strike and all that stuff, and you were talking of this literally, I mean, to the listeners, this is one of the greatest things I've ever read in my entire life. Apparently you said that ABC told you to go crazy and that they wanted anarchy, and then you said, well, we gave them anarchy, and it turns out they didn't mean that kind of anarchy. They wanted a happier, more ordered kind of anarchy. And and I like that. That to me sounds like this situation, because it's kind of like, what are we supposed to do to get people to hear our voice? What are we supposed to do to get them to understand what we're talking about, when it's like, when everyone's saying, oh, you need to talk about this, you need to talk louder. And then we do. And they're like, well, isn't this kind of a personal matter? Why are you discussing this in person?
Yeah. And, just in relation to that, that show that I was on, the work that I did on that show, I would have been an undiagnosed mentally ill person at that point. And all the qualities that my mental illness brought to the job served me really well in that job.
Yeah.
It meant that I went a long way, and it really added to me being someone quite different on television. But, and I became quite famous doing that. And then when the fame disappeared, those qualities did not serve me well in a real life setting at all. When there was a camera crew following me, it was fine. Everyone loved it. But in a real life setting, saying what you think just without any filter is not always helpful.
Yeah.
And I also think that, back then, and I mentioned this in my show, I was called a genius. People, oh, she's a genius. Now I'm just called crazy. and it's kind of like fame and, gives you a certain amount of leeway with that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And then when the fame disappeared, it just denigrated into like, oh, she's crazy.
Well, to be fair, I still see you as a genius, but I think that like what you're doing, it's just different today. I mean, like when it comes to the work that you do, because I thought it was interesting when you brought up that, some of this stuff actually helped with your performances and all of that stuff, because it is kind of weird when you find out that certain aspects of a disorder or a syndrome or being twitchy as hell can really help you out with what you're doing. But then it can also help you out in different ways today in talking about it and actually like the Tracy Lacy books. I mean, those things, getting an outlet where you can talk about important things, but in a fun children's way is, I mean, that's so important. And that is definitely a benefit from things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I sort of didn't want to become the poster child for borderline personality disorder.
Oh, that's fair.
And, but at the same time, it is something that people keep coming to me about. And I get a lot of messages on my social media, direct messages from people who say, I've just been diagnosed, I'm devastated, And so I didn't want to be the poster child, but at the same time, I feel like I have a little bit of a responsibility, because if I'm not talking about it, then who is? There's right. A couple of people in Hollywood there's a guy on Saturday Night Live who was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. He's been talking about it a little bit. And yeah, I feel like I do have a bit of a responsibility to remove this stigma and get people more accepting of mental illness in our lives, because it's not that uncommon.
Well, and borderline can be very frightening because of the stigmas and the stereotypes. I mean, like I had a friend who recently found out that they have borderline personality disorder, and all they've heard about it are the serial killers that have borderline personality disorder. And their first thought was, well, does this make me a cannibal? Like, is that what this means? And
well,
so it's like, no, that's only if you're very hungry.
Even in the medical profession, there's stigma attached. Like, I had one doctor say to me, don't tell other doctors you have this.
Yeah.
Because they will dismiss you. Mm-hmm. Certainly in the last 5 years, I think that's changed a bit, and they seem more willing to diagnose people with this illness than they once were. So in that regard, I guess that's progress. But yeah, I mean, professionally and stuff, I still feel like it's caused a lot of suffering for me.
Do you find that with doctors, because, I mean, you said that medical professionals, there's a stigma there, and a lot of neurologists don't seem to know a lot about some of this stuff. And I mean, to this day, in 2021, the things like autism, things like Tourette's syndrome, there are neurologists telling people they can't have them because they're women. I mean, do you know if this is something with borderline, or are we just particularly special?
No, well, with borderline, it is largely women who are diagnosed with it.
Okay.
But we're often dismissed as dramatic, hysterical, very dismissive terms for something that is really real. Like we feel more deeply as a borderline person, and we react more extremely with borderline. That's just part of the disorder. It's learning to control those impulses that are the skills that we have to develop so that we can exist in a world where that's just not appropriate.
How weird is, it's like saying this in 2021 sounds like such a medieval thing to say of like, it just gets dismissed as hysteria. And it's like, really? We're still saying this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, sorry, I'm just going to have to put my cat out because just a minute.
That's fine. I know exactly what you're dealing with. I have a cat as well, and I have to make sure she is not in the room because she will find paper bags that I didn't even know were in here and just start going to town on them.
Fuck's just like, I don't know, all the little mice are coming out now, so he's out there wanting to hunt all the time. So.
Yeah.
I think with borderline, it's very easy to be dismissive of the disorder because so much of this disorder is extreme emotion. So it is very easy just to attach that label, oh, histrionic, dramatic, so much drama, like it's just too easy to do that. When really what's going on for the person is they're feeling so intensely.
Right.
So intensely. There's no way that they have the skill, unless they've learned the skill, to control it.
Yeah. Exactly, and you've said you said this in the video that you did that you you found out that you had borderline when you were 44. Before you were diagnosed with it, too. Like, I mean, did it? I'm trying to figure out how to word this properly. Like, did you find that like you noticed aspects of it, or did it kind of feel more like it was developing over time?
No, it's funny because I read a book about Marilyn Monroe in my late 20s, and in it discussed how she had borderline personality disorder.
Okay.
And this therapist had listed the traits in the book. And I remember thinking, that just sounds like me. Like these points are exactly what I go through. And it always stayed in my mind, but I never sort of said it to anyone. And in the meantime, like I'd gone through drug addiction, I'd been in rehab, I'd been diagnosed as depressive, I'd been diagnosed as bipolar, I'd been diagnosed as all these things, but really all those things were part of borderline. And it wasn't until I mentioned to a doctor, look, when I was in my 20s, I read this thing about Marilyn Monroe and I really identified with the diagnosis that they'd given her. Yeah. And she explored it and she went, yeah, I think this is, it's, and to her credit, she said, it's not my area of expertise. It does sound like you. Let's get you to a specialist.
Yeah. That's the thing is, there's such a vast amount of information today that finding stuff that you can relate to, whether it turns out you have it or not. I mean, everything's just a Google search away now.
Oh, yeah, God, University of YouTube. We've all been there. There is so much information available. I do try to, not kind of Google too much about it because I find it too distressing. Like literally when
WebMD.
I just find it too distressing to even read about borderline because the way it's sometimes spoken about, it's really full on.
Oh, yeah.
And I just sort of stick to my therapist and stick to, my therapy sessions and kind of working through the issues that way because I just get too frightened otherwise.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned earlier about the comorbid aspect of borderline, and that's the same with Tourette syndrome as well. I find it interesting because I've been diagnosed with a shopping list of things throughout my life. And I feel like every time I go into to see a new therapist, it's like they're like the day they've been waiting for their entire life. Like, because they're just like, oh, it's very clear that you have this. And I'm like, all right, so are we done here? And they're like, well, are we? And I'm like, oh, there's more. If you want more, I've got more.
Yeah. Oh, goody, fresh meat.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I had to go and do DBT training, which is one of the things that they recommend for people with borderline. And it was being at an institution 3 days a week doing learning these different skills. But, oh, my God, it was the worst. It was the worst. So a room full of people with borderline, it was just not somewhere where I could flourish. I actually chose not to do it that way. I chose to just go back to single therapy. I couldn't deal with it.
Okay.
And I couldn't deal with it, not because of them, but because of myself. I seemed to be creating so much conflict in these sessions that it was like, okay, I've got to get out of here because clearly I'm not at this level yet.
Yeah, well, that's the thing that people don't realize about this stuff is, people see the outside perspective of it and they think, oh, what if you did this or what if you did this? They don't realize how, I posted a video on social media the other day of one of my tics, and someone messaged me or commented saying, is having Tourette syndrome uncomfortable? And I mean, me having it my whole life, I'm just thinking, well, that's kind of a silly question. But then I thought with all the stigmas around it, maybe people really think that this stuff isn't that tough to live with and that it is just what they see.
Yeah. Well, actually, I watched The World's a Little Blurry, the Billie Eilish documentary. And in there, she talks only a very small moment about her Tourette's.
Right.
And at one point she has, I don't know, what do you call it? An attack or?
Tic attacks. Yeah.
Yeah. She had one in the video. And I didn't even know that, but yeah, it is the kind of illness, I guess, that, I don't know. Do Tourette's people have triggers? Like, does it become worse if you're triggered in any way?
We do. I've been doing this series on. Oh man, I'm like getting triggered just thinking about. Yeah, like so we have these. I've been doing this video series, 31 Days of Tics, where every day I talk about a different tic that I have, and there are certain words that if I just say them or I hear them, I like for the next 5 minutes, that's like the only word that's in my head. And I just start saying it over and over again, various, like different variations on it. I would say what they are, but then the rest of this interview will just be me shouting those words. Yeah,
well, I'll see your trigger and I'll raise you mine. Yeah, because that's a big thing with borderline too, that like the triggers, create such intense reactions.
Yeah.
And, like throwing chairs, beating people up kind of reactions that you really have to learn to find these ways of comforting yourself. Otherwise it just becomes impossible.
Well, it's such a weird thing to say that, at least with Tourette's, if I throw a chair at someone, they go, oh, it's just Tourette's. I never thought I'd have that like be able to pull the Tourette card like that, but
yeah, damn it, wish I'd got Tourette's.
I know, right? But before
I could throw a lot more chairs.
I'd get away with so many other things. But now I did want to move on here because I mean this is. This stuff, it is, a topic that I could discuss for hours, but, unfortunately we don't have hours. But this year you are performing a brand new show and it is called Catch a Falling Star, which, by the way, love the name. And I have a note here to say a joke, but it's insanely unacceptable. It's just, this is like, how as a comedian, like you don't open with your worst joke. Like I thought of this at the beginning of the chat here. It is, so Tanya, spill the Vegemite. That's just off. Like, I mean, Vegemite is a spread. You can't spill a spread.
Yeah, no, lose that joke.
I'm throwing that one out. But tell me about Catch a Falling Star, because this sounds absolutely amazing.
Well, back in the 80s and 90s, I became quite a well-known person in Australia, became quite famous. And by 1992, I was a full-blown heroin addict.
Yeah.
And so this show looks at that journey. And part of that journey was being fired from the show that I was on, and it was very public and very humiliating.
Yeah.
I look at, what is it like to go from someone who is just a regular person to suddenly, a year later being incredibly famous. And then a couple of years after that, there's nothing.
Right.
And it was a really, I mean, there's no doubt I had fun during that time and I loved what I did. I really did. But a lot of it was to do with being a woman in the industry and, being an unusual woman in the industry. And, I got really punished for that. Yeah. So I talk about that and what it's like to just fall from grace. But it wasn't my first fall. That's the other thing I talk about in the show. I got into the Victorian College of the Arts School of Dance in 1984. And then in 1985, my teacher dropped me. He was drunk. And tore my leg apart and my knee joint. And so I sort of talk about, like I've had these falls several times in my life. It's not just a one-time thing. It's been so up and down. And
some literal falls.
Yeah, literally falling.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's looking at the kind of, the metaphor of that, if you like, throughout my career.
Well, the story that you tell of being dropped and receiving that injury. I mean, it's such a traumatic story, but it's also very inspiring how you dealt with it. I mean, the fact that you instead of just giving up altogether and saying, you know what, I can't dance anymore. That's it. You said, you know what? No, I'll just get into choreography. I'll help other people come up with, routines. And that's pretty much how you got discovered, was actually, switching to choreography.
Yeah. Well, it's a crazy story. I mean, I choreographed Kylie Minogue's Locomotion video, and I'm in that as well. Mm-hmm. And then I was spotted at a pop show. I was dancing on this pop show, and I was literally spotted. They rang me up a couple of weeks later, asked me to come in for an audition. I went in for the audition. Several auditions later, I got the job. And, but the funny thing was, the only reason I think I did so well is because no one gave a shit about what I was doing. They really didn't care. I was just some chick that they didn't even really want on the show.
Really?
Yeah. And so I just ran riot. I had this awesome director, great crew, and we just did our own thing. And they just ignored me. And by the time people were taking notice, it was too late. I was already too popular for them to be able to go, oh, well,
So you were causing kerfuffles before you even got on TV.
Indeed, I was. There's always been a really strong rebellious streak in me. I don't know where that comes from. And I miss seeing rebels on TV. Like, I really miss, there used to be a lot of that on Aussie TV. And particularly with women, we had an era where there was some really fantastic, funny, amazingly bawdy women on TV, and they were rebels, and I look at the women now and it's like everyone's so conservative. Yeah. And I don't know where to find these women anymore.
You know what it was? It was Neighbours. I mean, every Australian ends up on Neighbours, and then everything changes.
Yeah, that's right. You release a single, the rest is history.
I thought that was so wild. I did a podcast years ago, and it was like every single Australian that I had on the podcast, no matter what they did for a living, they were all like, yeah, so at one point I was on Neighbours, and I'm like, do all of you do this?
Well, I actually was on Neighbours. Yeah. One whole episode. No, I think that what's become really interesting in Hollywood is that, we have the National Institute of Dramatic Arts is our most prestigious drama school in Australia. But people will be more inclined to take people who've done Neighbours and Home and Away. Like, that has become a stronger brand than our exclusive training drama school.
So it literally is kind of like the welcome to the business thing by getting in that show.
Yeah. I mean, Chris Hemsworth, all of them, they've done Neighbours, Guy Pearce, all these people, they were on Neighbours or Home and Away. And those shows have launched the careers of so many people. Yeah. And yeah, it's a really strong brand.
I mean, that's amazing though. It's kind of like that age old thing of like, you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. Do Neighbours and then we'll talk,
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of it too is they always cast such exceptionally good looking people. So they know if they've done Neighbours, well, they're going to be good looking and they can, act. They know what to do in front of a camera. Let's go.
Yeah, exactly. So getting back to your show though, so you have Catch a Falling Star coming out. When is this happening? And I mean, it is still the pandemic. And you say that it's a live show. How is this happening during the pandemic?
Well, I am actually pre-recording it at a venue in Berlin. And I've adjusted the show a little bit for this because the live show was different from how I'm going to film it and the way that it's going to be filmed, because we're filming it without an audience. So we're making that a feature.
Right. Yeah.
I've had to make some changes to the show to enable me to do it, but it will be a filmed piece that will stream during the Brighton Festival.
Oh, okay. Yeah. This is something that I wanted to ask you, like, I mean, where do you see the future of performance going? Because I've been thinking about this a lot, because I mean, as a stand-up comedian, you know, I mean, all my gigs are going Zoom. All of them are going virtually. And I keep thinking, like, I mean, it's such a different form of comedy because it's so different, but it would be interesting to see when we go back to doing things, you know, live in person, seeing how they can kind of be mixed and matched.
Well, yeah. And I think, I mean, personally, I much prefer it with being live.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm so amazed at how quickly we've gotten used to watching things online, things that you would never normally expect to be online, like comedy. You know, like we've really learned to because it's better to have something than nothing, you know? And so that was my same attitude with the festival. It was better to be doing something rather than nothing. You know, I think given the choice, and when this is over, and I think it's going to be years, people will opt to go live. Yeah. But in the meantime, we've just got to make the best of it.
It is interesting. I mean, how fast everyone just reacted to all of this, and they just got so used to it. I mean, everyone's been talking about how the pandemic, like I've been saying, the pandemic, like it's been 1 year, and I'm like, so is it time to retire now? What's going on?
Let me retire on my tens of dollars that I've earned in the last year.
My tens of cryptocurrency that's not even available yet.
Yeah. Well, in Australia, though, they've handled the pandemic really well. Sure, it's only a population of 25 million. But, you know, like they are back performing live, socially distanced, but they're in theatres, they're having festivals, all that kind of stuff. And because they got the cases down to zero, when 5 cases pop up, they lock down that particular area and they can contact trace because it's 5 cases, you know.
Yeah.
So things are very different there. Like people are back performing, and I'm watching all my friends on social media and I'm just so jealous and envious.
I hear that.
Yeah. So, I mean, they just had Adelaide Fringe. They're just about to go into Melbourne Comedy Festival. So, sure, it's socially distanced, but it's happening. And, you know, like currently I'm sitting waiting to hear what's going to be happening with Edinburgh because I feel like they're dragging their feet a little bit. They're wanting the live thing. They're not really offering a streaming thing. So I'm sort of, you know, I want my show to stream there if they offer it, but if not, can't do it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the same thing that I mean, all the Fringe festivals are doing this. They're going away from the streaming, which is really weird for a fucking Fringe festival. You know, I mean, you'd think that they'd be the ones going, you know what, we just want your art, you know?
Yeah. Well, you know, I think particularly with a festival the size of Edinburgh, there's so much more at stake than just the performances and the money that they make from tickets, because it's millions of people that go through the city, and it's accommodation, it's food, it's just so much stuff.
Oh, yeah.
So, you know, and they're beholden to very big promoters, whereas Brighton Fringe is still a bit more on edge and, you know, smaller and a bit more edgy. So, yeah. I'm just glad that I'll be able to get the show out there, because I really got to a point where I just felt like I have to say this stuff. I have to talk about what it's like to have gone from, you know, I can't walk down the street to, hello, is anyone there?
Right.
You know?
Exactly.
And with a mental illness that was at that point undiagnosed. And, you know, like the sacking and everything was really traumatic, but it wasn't the reason that I used drugs. You know, like the reason I used drugs was largely because I was medicating a very serious illness. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a thing that, I mean, that's why so many people self-medicate with weed, for example, because it's not like, I mean, especially when you don't know what's going on and you're just trying to cope with something without knowing, it's so easy to fall into that, you know, route.
Well, what I have since discovered is microdosing.
Okay.
And that's a large part of the reason I was actually even able to sit and focus long enough to be able to write this show. Because, I'd heard about it, but I couldn't get access to it. And so then my husband, in his wisdom, got a mushroom growing kit, grew the mushrooms, we dried them, ground them up, and I microdosed. And it improved my life no end. Like, I cut my antidepressants down by a third. I'm down to a third of the dose I was on, and I feel so much better. And microdosing changed my life.
That's amazing.
And it's why I suddenly felt like, okay, I can write this show now. I can talk about this now. I'm clear enough to be able to do it.
That's good. Yeah. And research about this has been popping up left and right. So because we are getting close to the end here, and I've been like in my head, because I have so much ADD, I'm just constantly going, I have to make sure I get this. I have to make sure I get this, because this is one of my favorite things that you have ever done that no one has been able to see. And I want to quickly hear the story before we go, because it is the Mick Hucknall story.
Yes.
Because I read that this was like one of your favorite sketches that basically never ended up getting released.
Yeah. Well, on the show that I was on, we did this segment where the joke was that I was going to prepare to be Mick Hucknall. I was going to go to the gig. I was going to perform the gig. I was going to go to the party. I was going to dress up as him. There was a whole big setup. And then I would walk to the door with my camera crew saying, I'm Mick Hucknall. I've got my gig here. And the security would go, no way.
Right.
Piss off. Anyway, what happened was we did all that big setup, and that was the whole thing. It was supposed to just end with, no, you're not Mick Hucknall, go away. I get to the door, I say, I'm Mick Hucknall, and they say, right this way, Mick, and showed me to his dressing room. And so then I'm in the dressing room with the other band members with like this red curly wig on and freckles painted on my face. And, I'm sort of trying to convince them I'm Mick Hucknall. And I'm like, yeah, I'm Mick Hucknall. I'm here to do the gig. Let's rock it out, boys. And then this security and this woman came in, and I was like, hi, I'm Mick Hucknall. How do you do? And she was like, no, you're fucking not. Now get out. And they marched me down the stairs with my crew, and then they took my crew into a separate room, and they took the tapes from them. They said, we want the tapes now. And they heavied him for the tapes, so he had to hand them over.
Jeez.
By the time we got back to the studio, the promoter of that concert, who was a very powerful man, had gotten wind of this. I got back to the studio. They were waiting for me out the front, like, you are in so much trouble.
Right.
And anyway, there was a big hullabaloo. I had to publicly apologize for the terrible, terrible thing I'd done and all that kind of stuff. And then about a couple of months later, there was another band visiting from the UK, and I don't know who they were. I can't remember. But I'm in the green room of the show that I'm doing, and they're like, oh, my God, you're that girl. And I'm like, what girl? And they're like, there's a tape doing the rounds in London of you, like amongst the record companies and stuff, of you dressed up as Mick Hucknall.
So it did get out a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit. And I was like, are you kidding me? Like, how do I get my hands on the tapes? And that was what that became, just a great story of legend.
Because imagine like doing that today. That would go viral.
Yeah. Oh, God. I talk about this in the show too. So much of what I did, I see, male comedians doing the same thing and having hugely successful careers, and they're called innovative. I'm just called trouble. So
well that will I see. I want to say that will change soon, but we've been trying to change this for ages.
Yeah, it's not going to change.
But we are going to. But we're going to keep pushing for it to change, and that's what's important, But Tania, first of all, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. It's been so much fun talking to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And before we go, where can our listeners find out more information about you and how to watch Catch a Falling Star?
Okay, so if you go to the Brighton Fringe website, which is brightonfringe.org, and the tickets will be on sale on the website. They haven't gone on sale yet. I think they go on sale in a couple of weeks.
Okay.
And my show runs from the Friday the 28th of May to Saturday the 6th of June. So it's just like a really compact week. That's when you log on. It's £3.50 for a ticket, and you just watch the show.
Perfect.
Please watch the show.
Yeah.
Or I'll have to throw a chair.
You'll have to throw two chairs. One will be real and one will be virtual, and they'll never know which one it'll be.
You bet.
Well, thank you so much. And now for the part that no one's been waiting for, the outro. So if you want to find out more information about My Voices Have Tourettes, check us out on Facebook, Instagram at My Voices Have Tourettes, our Twitter at MVHT Show. We also have MVHTshow.com. You can find out more you can find me on all social medias, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok at Dan Zarin Comedy. If you want to support the show, if you have any questions or if you have any topics that you want us to talk about, or you just want to connect with more people and talk about this stuff, check out our new discussion group, MVHT Podcast Discussion Group. It's on Facebook, so check it out there. You can also check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/MVHT Show, where we'll be offering bonus episodes that you don't get to hear normally on this podcast, really at all. They're not going to be on this podcast at all, but we will do them just for our Patreons. This episode has been brought to you by Gamesless Studio, where we are recording, The Secret Cellar, Iceland's first and only comedy club, and Smaude's Volcano Sauces, the greatest hot sauces I've ever had in my entire life. And again, to the Icelanders, check out the new pizza, Volcano Pizza at Pizzan here in Iceland. It's absolutely incredible. And if you're listening to this on Spotify or any of those streaming services, be sure to like or follow or subscribe to our podcast and leave us a 5-star review if you loved the podcast. If you hated it, leave us a 1-star review, but let us know what you didn't like so we can maybe work on it and improve for the future. I mean, you can't please everyone, but we can certainly try. Other than that, thank you all so much for listening, and check out new episodes every Tuesday.